The rain hammered against the windows of the Los Angeles courthouse like 1,000 desperate fingers trying to get inside. Judge Margaret Chen sat behind her massive oak desk, staring at the document that would change everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she read a petition for the third time that morning. Someone wanted to exhume Michael Jackson's body, and they had reasons that made her stomach turn with a mixture of dread and awful curiosity. 12 years had passed since the King of Pop took his last breath. 12 years since the world stopped spinning for millions of fans who couldn't believe their idol was gone. 12 years since that June day in 2009 when the news broke and grown men and women collapsed in the streets, sobbing like children who'd lost their way home. But now, in 2021, someone was demanding answers that had been buried 6 feet underground in Forest Lawn Memorial Park. The petition came from an unlikely source. Dr. Raymond Foster wasn't some tabloid journalist or conspiracy theorist looking for fame. He was a respected forensic pathologist from Johns Hopkins University, and his credentials filled 2 entire pages. More importantly, he had new evidence. Evidence that suggested the toxicology reports from Michael's autopsy might have been incomplete. Evidence that pointed to substances in the singer's system that had never been publicly disclosed. Evidence that could mean the difference between accidental death and something far more sinister. Judge Chen had spent 3 sleepless nights reviewing the case files. She'd read every page of the original autopsy report, studied the photograph from the death scene, and listened to the 911 call so many times she could recite it from memory. The housekeeper's panicked voice still echoed in her mind. The desperate attempt to revive a legend who was already gone. The chaos that followed when the ambulance arrived and found the world's most famous entertainer lying lifeless in his bedroom. But Dr. Foster's petition raised questions that gnawed at her sense of justice. What if they'd missed something? What if the truth had been buried along with the body? What if Michael Jackson's children deserved to know what really happened to their father on that terrible day? The legal battle that followed was unlike anything the entertainment world had ever seen. Michael's estate fought the exhumation with every weapon in their legal arsenal. They argued about dignity, about respect for the dead, about the trauma it would cause his family. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that opening the tomb would devastate his children. They called witnesses who spoke about Michael's wishes for a peaceful eternal rest. They even hired public relations firms to paint Dr. Foster as a gal seeking publicity at a dead man's expense. But Dr. Foster had something more powerful than lawyers and PR firms. He had science. He had questions that refused to stay buried. And most importantly, he had convinced one of Michael's siblings that the truth mattered more than peace. LaToya Jackson sat in the witness stand, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She spoke about conversations with her brother in the months before his death. How he'd seemed paranoid, convinced that someone was trying to control him. How he'd lost weight at an alarming rate, his skin turning almost translucent. How he called her one night, 3 weeks before he died, and whispered that if anything happened to him, she should look deeper than the surface. The courtroom fell silent when she played a voicemail Michael had left her. His voice, weak and slurred, rambled about people in his life who didn't have his best interests at heart. People who saw him as a money machine rather than a human being. People who would do anything to keep the machine running, even if it destroyed the man inside. Judge Chen listened to that voicemail 5 times. Each time, she heard something different. Fear, exhaustion, a desperate plea for help that came too late. When the recording ended, she looked at the lawyers representing the estate and saw them shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They knew what she knew. Something wasn't right about this case. Something had never been right. The media circus that erupted outside the courthouse was exactly what everyone had feared. News vans lined the streets for blocks. Reporters shouted questions at anyone who emerged from a building. Fans held vigil on the courthouse steps, some praying for the exhumation to be denied, others demanding the truth at any cost. Arguments broke out. Friendships ended. The world divided itself into camps, and the battle lines were drawn in grief and suspicion. Inside her chambers, Judge Chen made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She approved the exhumation under strict conditions. It would be done in complete secrecy, with only essential personnel present. Every moment would be documented by court-appointed videographers. The remains would be treated with absolute dignity and respect. And most importantly, the result of any new test would be sealed until it could be properly reviewed and verified. She signed the order with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else. The date was set for 3 weeks later, in the early morning hours when the world would still be sleeping. Only a handful of people would know it was happening. Only a select few would witness what the cameras were about to capture. And none of them were prepared for what they would find when they finally opened Michael Jackson's tomb. The convoy arrived at Forest Lawn Memorial Park at exactly 2:30 in the morning. 6 black vehicles with tinted windows moved through the gates like a funeral procession in reverse, their headlights cutting through the fog that had settled over the cemetery like a shroud. Security guards had cleared the entire section hours earlier, establishing a perimeter that kept everyone at least 500 yards away from the mausoleum where Michael Jackson had rested for over a decade. Dr. Raymond Foster stepped out of the lead vehicle, his medical bag clutched tightly in his hand. At 56 years old, he performed over 3,000 autopsies in his career, but nothing had prepared him for the weight of this moment. Behind him, a team of specialists emerged from the other vehicles. Forensic technicians, DNA analysts, toxicologists, and 3 videographers whose cameras would record every second of what was about to unfold. The mausoleum loomed before them, its white marble walls gleaming in the portable lights that the technical crew had set up. Michael's crypt was located in the Holy Terrace section, a place reserved for Hollywood royalty. His neighbors in death included Clark Gable, Jean Harlow, and other legends from cinema's golden age. But none of them generated the kind of attention that still surrounded the King of Pop even in death. Judge Chen had appointed a witness committee to observe the proceedings. They stood in a tight cluster near the entrance, their faces pale in the artificial light. LaToya Jackson was there, flanked by 2 family attorneys. She wore dark sunglasses despite the hour, as if trying to hide from what she'd set in motion. Beside her stood Katherine Jackson, Michael's mother, now 91 years old and leaning heavily on a cane. She'd fought against the exhumation initially, but LaToya had convinced her that Michael would want the truth revealed, whatever it might be. The third member of the witness committee was more controversial. Thomas Mesereau, the attorney who defended Michael during the 2005 trial, had insisted on being present. He'd spent years studying the circumstances of his former client's death, and he developed theories that made even seasoned investigators uncomfortable. Theories about conspiracies and cover-ups. Theories about powerful people who'd wanted Michael silenced. Theories that were about to be tested against cold, hard evidence. A representative from the Los Angeles County Coroner's office stood off to one side, his arms crossed over his chest. Dr. Alan Peterson had signed Michael's original death certificate, ruling the manner of death as homicide caused by acute propofol intoxication. He'd testified at Conrad Murray's trial, helping to send a cardiologist to prison for involuntary manslaughter. But now, watching this team prepare to reopen a case he considered closed, doubt flickered across his face. The cemetery director approached Dr. Foster with a set of keys. His name was Marcus Williams, and he'd worked at Forest Lawn for 32 years. He'd been present when they'd sealed Michael's crypt, and he remembered every detail of that day. The thousands of mourners, the private service attended by only family and close friends, the golden casket that had cost over $25,000, and the strange feeling he'd had, even then, that something about the entire situation felt incomplete. "We've never done anything like this," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "In all my years here, we've never opened a celebrity crypt. Are you sure this is necessary?" Dr. Foster met his eyes. "Mr. Williams, if there's even a 1% chance that we miss something important, then yes, it's necessary. Michael Jackson didn't just belong to his family. He belonged to the world, and the world deserved the truth." The technical team began setting up their equipment. Lights, cameras, audio recorders, a mobile laboratory that had been assembled inside a climate-controlled tent. Every piece of technology was state-of-the-art, designed to capture evidence that would stand up in any courtroom on Earth. The lead videographer, a woman named Sandra Lopez, checked each camera angle 3 times. She knew that what they recorded tonight would be scrutinized by millions of people. There could be no mistakes. At precisely 3 o'clock, Marcus Williams inserted the first key into the crypt's lock. The sound it made echoed through the mausoleum like a gunshot. LaToya gasped. Katherine Jackson gripped her cane so tightly her knuckles turned white. Thomas Mesereau stepped forward, his lawyer's instinct demanding a front-row view of whatever came next. The crypt door was solid bronze, weighing nearly 200 pounds. It took 3 cemetery workers to slowly pull it open. The hinges groaned in protest, as if the dead themselves were objecting to this intrusion. Cold air rushed out from the opening, carrying with it a smell that made several people step back. It wasn't the smell of decay, something the sealed environment had prevented. It was something else. Something chemical. Something wrong. Dr. Foster pulled on latex gloves and a surgical mask. He nodded to Sandra Lopez, who raised her camera. "We're going in," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Document everything." The casket came into view as the lights penetrated the darkness of the crypt. It was exactly as it had been the day they'd sealed it, resting on a marble platform. The golden surface was still pristine, untarnished by time. But there was something on top of it that made everyone freeze. A single white glove, placed carefully in the center of the lid. The same kind of glove Michael had made famous throughout his career. "That wasn't there when we sealed the crypt," Marcus Williams said, his voice cracking with confusion and fear. "I would have remembered. I would have seen it. Someone's been inside since we closed this tomb." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled group. If someone had accessed the crypt, what else had they done? Had they tampered with the body? Had they removed evidence? Had they added something that wasn't there before? The questions multiplied faster than anyone could answer them, and suddenly, the exhumation had become something more than a search for medical truth. It had become a crime scene investigation. Dr. Foster photographed the glove from every angle before carefully placing it in an evidence bag. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing. 12 years had passed since Michael's death, and in all that time, this crypt had supposedly remained sealed. The cemetery maintained 24-hour security. Access was restricted and logged. Yet somehow, someone had gotten inside and left a message. A symbol, a warning or a clue, depending on how you interpreted it. "Open the casket." Judge Chen's voice crackled through the radio. She was watching everything via live feed from a secure location downtown. "We've come this far. We need to see what's inside." The cemetery workers positioned themselves around the golden casket. They'd practiced this procedure early in the day using a replica, but nothing could prepare them for the reality of opening the coffin of the most famous entertainer who'd ever lived. On the count of 3, they lifted the lid. The hydraulics hissed softly as the seal broke. And inside, the cameras captured everything. The first thing that struck everyone was how perfectly preserved everything appeared. The interior of the casket was lined with cream-colored silk, still pristine after 12 years in the sealed environment. Michael Jackson lay exactly as he'd been positioned for his funeral, dressed in the pearl-beaded jacket he'd worn during his 1984 Grammy Awards appearance, when he'd won a record-breaking 8 awards in one night. His hands were crossed over his chest, and on his fingers were several of his iconic rings, including the one with the enormous diamond that had been a gift from Elizabeth Taylor. But something was immediately, horribly wrong. Dr. Foster leaned closer, his eyes narrowing behind his protective glasses. The face didn't match the photograph from the funeral. The skin tone was different, the features subtly altered. He'd studied Michael's autopsy photos extensively, memorized every detail of the body that had been examined in 2009. This body shared similarities, but there were discrepancies that made his professional instinct scream with alarm. "Get the portable X-ray machine," he said sharply. "Now!" Sandra Lopez's camera captured every moment as the technical team wheeled in the equipment. LaToya Jackson pushed closer, trying to see what had disturbed the doctor. Her mother grabbed her arm, pulling her back, perhaps sensing that whatever came next would shatter whatever piece they'd managed to find over the past 12 years. The X-ray images appeared on the monitor within minutes, and what they showed made Dr. Foster's blood run cold. The skeletal structure was wrong. Michael Jackson had broken his nose several times throughout his life, the result of both accidents and multiple cosmetic surgeries. Those breaks were well documented in his medical records, creating a distinctive pattern on X-rays. The skull in this casket showed no such patterns. The dental work didn't match either. Michael had received extensive dental treatment throughout his life, including several crowns and fillings that should have been clearly visible on the X-rays. They weren't there. "This isn't Michael Jackson," Dr. Foster said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. "This is someone else's body." The words hung in the air for 3 full seconds before chaos erupted. LaToya Jackson screamed. Katherine Jackson collapsed into her attorney's arms. Thomas Mesereau was already on his phone, shouting for additional security. The cemetery workers backed away from the casket as if it had suddenly become radioactive. And Sandra Lopez kept filming, her hands shaking but her camera steady, capturing the moment that everything everyone thought they knew about Michael Jackson's death fell apart. Dr. Foster worked quickly, collecting samples with the precision of someone who understood that every piece of evidence might be crucial. Hair samples, tissue samples, fingerprints from the hands that lay so peacefully in the casket, DNA swabs from the mouth and beneath the fingernails. Everything was labeled, documented, and sealed according to strict forensic protocols. The chain of custody would be unbreakable. Whatever they discovered from these tests would be indisputable. But even without the DNA results, Dr. Foster could see the differences. The body in the casket was approximately the same height as Michael had been, and similar in build. But the hands were wrong. Michael's hands had been long and slender, a pianist's hands that he'd used to create magic on stage. These hands were shorter, thicker, the fingers more blunt. Someone had dressed his body in Michael's clothes, adorned it with his jewelry, and positioned it exactly as he'd been displayed at his memorial service. The question that terrified everyone was simple and devastating. If this wasn't Michael Jackson, then where was he? Thomas Mesereau stepped forward, his lawyer's mind already constructing theories and counter-arguments. We need to seal this scene immediately. This is no longer just an exhumation. This is a potential fraud investigation, possibly a murder cover-up. Everyone who knew about this operation needs to be interviewed. We need to trace back to the original funeral, find out who had access to the body, who prepared it, who sealed the casket. Judge Chen's voice came through the radio, tight with controlled panic. Dr. Foster, I need you to be absolutely certain about this. The implications are beyond anything we could have imagined. Are you sure this isn't Michael Jackson? Your Honor, I'm as certain as I can be without DNA confirmation, Dr. Foster replied. But I'm willing to stake my entire career on this. The body in this casket is not the same body that was autopsied in 2009. Someone switched them. The question is when, where, and most importantly, why. The technical team continued their work, photographing every inch of the casket and its contents. They discovered other anomalies. The lining showed signs of having been disturbed and resealed. There were microscopic fibers that didn't match the original materials used by the casket manufacturer. And underneath the body, barely visible, was a small piece of paper, folded into a tight square. Dr. Foster extracted the paper with tweezers, unfolding it carefully under the bright lights. It was a handwritten note, just 4 words in elegant cursive script. Find the real one. The handwriting didn't match any known samples of Michael Jackson's signature. It had been written recently, the ink still dark and unfaded. Someone who knew about this exhumation, or who had anticipated it, had left a message, a challenge or a clue, pointing them toward a truth that grew more complex and sinister with every passing moment. Katherine Jackson had recovered enough to speak, her voice weak but determined. My son told me stories about people who wanted to control him, people who saw him as a commodity instead of a person. He used to say that they'd never let him retire, that they'd work him until he dropped dead. I thought it was the stress talking, the paranoia that came from being famous his entire life. But what if he was right? What if he knew they were planning something? LaToya added, Michael talked about faking his death. I thought he was joking, using it as a metaphor for wanting to escape the pressure. But what if it wasn't a metaphor? What if he actually did it? What if he found a way to walk away from everything, and this body is part of that plan? The alternative theory was darker, that Michael hadn't faked his death by choice, but that someone had murdered him and replaced his body to cover their tracks. That somewhere, in a place no one had thought to look, the real Michael Jackson lay buried or hidden. That for 12 years, the world had mourned at an empty tomb while the truth rotted in an unmarked grave. Dr. Foster looked at the cameras, knowing that this footage would eventually be seen by millions. We need to expand this investigation immediately. We need to exhume the body that was autopsied in 2009 and compare it to the autopsy photographs. We need to interview everyone who was present at the hospital, at the funeral home, at the burial. And we need to find out if Michael Jackson is actually dead, or if the greatest entertainer in history pulled off the greatest disappearing act of all time. The sun was starting to rise outside the mausoleum, casting long shadows across the marble floors. The night that was supposed to provide answers had only generated more questions. But as the team prepared to seal the casket and transport it to a secure facility for further examination, everyone present understood that they had stumbled onto something far bigger than a botched autopsy report. They'd uncovered a mystery that would consume the media, captivate the public, and possibly rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about what happened on June 25, 2009. Sandra Lopez powered down her camera as the first rays of sunlight penetrated the mausoleum. She had hundreds of hours of footage, every second potentially explosive. As she packed her equipment, she noticed something the others had missed. Scratched into the marble wall beside the crypt, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were 3 numbers, 758. A combination? A date? A code pointing to something else entirely? She photographed it quickly, deciding to investigate on her own before mentioning it to the others. In a case this big, she thought information was power, and she had just found something that might be the key to everything. The forensic laboratory at UCLA Medical Center became ground zero for what the media had started calling the greatest mystery in music history. Dr. Foster's team worked around the clock, processing the samples they collected from the body in Michael Jackson's tomb. The DNA results would take weeks to process through the system, but other tests were already revealing disturbing information. The body in the casket had been professionally embalmed, but the chemical signature didn't match the methods used by the Forest Lawn mortuary team. Someone had used a different combination of preservatives, one more commonly employed in medical school cadaver preparation. This suggested that the body had been specifically selected and prepared for long-term preservation, not for a traditional funeral. Whoever had orchestrated this switch had planned it meticulously, understanding that eventually someone might look closely enough to notice a deception. Detective Maria Rodriguez from the LAPD's Robbery Homicide Division had been assigned to lead the criminal investigation. She'd worked hundreds of cases during her 23 years on the force, but nothing had prepared her for the complexity of this one. She sat in her office, surrounded by file boxes containing every document related to Michael Jackson's death, staring at a timeline that had more holes than Swiss cheese. The first problem was establishing when the switch had occurred. Michael's body had been transported from UCLA Medical Center to the coroner's office immediately after his death. The autopsy had been performed there, photographed extensively, and then the body had been released to the family. But there was a gap, a 12-hour period when the body had been at the O'Connor mortuary before being transferred to Forest Lawn for the memorial service. During those 12 hours, access logs showed that only 3 employees had been in the preparation room. Detective Rodriguez interviewed all 3 morticians who'd worked on Michael's body. The first 2 remembered nothing unusual. They prepared the body according to standard procedures, dressed it in the clothing the family had provided, and applied makeup to create the peaceful appearance the family had requested. But the third mortician, a man named James Chen, told a different story. There was a 4th person there that night. James said, his hands trembling as he sat across from the detective. A man in a suit, expensive looking, with credentials that said he was from the family's legal team. He said he needed to be present during the preparation for religious reasons. I thought it was strange, but he had all the right paperwork, so we let him stay. Did you get his name? Rodriguez asked. It was on the documents. Let me think. James closed his eyes, reaching back through 12 years of memories. Harrison. Something Harrison. First name or last name. I'm not sure, but he watched everything we did. He was particularly interested in the cosmetic work, made suggestions about the makeup, the positioning of the body, and now that I think about it, there was a period of about 30 minutes when he asked us to step out, said he needed to perform some kind of blessing. We waited outside. When he called us back in, I remember thinking the body looked slightly different, but I figured it was just my eyes playing tricks after hours of work. Detective Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. She pulled up the witness list from Michael's memorial service, searching for any name containing Harrison. Nothing. She checked the family's legal team. No Harrison there either. Whoever this man had been, he'd used fake credentials to gain access to Michael's body during the most crucial window of opportunity. Meanwhile, at the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, Dr. Peterson was reviewing the original autopsy photograph with new eyes. He performed that autopsy himself, spent hours documenting every detail of Michael Jackson's body. But now, Comparing those photographs to the X-rays from the exhumed remains, he saw the discrepancies that should have been obvious. The body he'd autopsied in 2009 had been Michael Jackson. The body in the tomb was someone else entirely. The switch happened after the autopsy, he told Detective Rodriguez during her interview. I'm certain of it. The body I examined was Michael Jackson. I compared it to his medical records, checked it against known scars and surgical alterations. But somewhere between the time it left my facility and when it was sealed in that tomb, someone made the exchange. The investigation expanded to include the funeral home, the cemetery, and everyone who'd had access to the casket between the autopsy and the burial. Security footage from that time period had been recorded over years ago, standard procedure after a certain length of time. But Detective Rodriguez found something interesting in the written security logs. There had been a brief power outage at the funeral home on the night before Michael's memorial service. The backup generators had kicked in immediately, but the cameras had been offline for approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes was all it would have taken. Thomas Mesereau had launched his own parallel investigation, using private investigators and legal resources to chase down leads the police couldn't pursue. He'd always suspected that Michael's death involved more people than just Conrad Murray, the doctor who'd been administering the propofol. Murray had been the fall guy, but Mesereau believed there were others lurking in the shadows, pulling strings and covering tracks. His investigators discovered financial records that painted a disturbing picture. In the months before Michael's death, several large payments had been made from offshore accounts to various individuals connected to his business affairs. The payments were structured to avoid detection, routed through shell companies and foreign banks. But if you knew where to look, the pattern became clear. Someone had been assembling a team, buying loyalty, ensuring that when the time came, certain people would look the other way. The most explosive discovery came from an investigator named Patricia Wong, who specialized in tracking international financial transactions. She found a payment of $2 million made to a mortuary services company in Nevada just 3 days after Michael's death. The company was a front, a shell corporation with no actual employees or facilities. But the payment description was chilling: special remains handling and preservation services. Someone had purchased a body approximately Michael Jackson's size and build, with similar racial characteristics that could be prepared and substituted for the real thing. The company had dissolved within months of that transaction, its owners vanishing into countries with no extradition treaties. But the paper trail proved that this switch hadn't been a spontaneous decision. It had been planned and executed with military precision. LaToya Jackson had become obsessed with finding her brother. She'd spent every waking hour since the exhumation reviewing his life, looking for clues about where he might be. If he was alive, if he'd somehow orchestrated his own disappearance, where would he go? Michael had always talked about places where he felt safe, where the pressures of fame couldn't touch him. Ireland, Bahrain, Neverland Ranch before it became a crime scene in the public's imagination. She hired a team of private investigators to search these locations, looking for any sign that Michael had been there in the past 12 years. They found nothing concrete, but there were whispers, stories from locals who swore they'd seen someone who looked like Michael, always at a distance, always gone before anyone could get close. A man in Bahrain who'd been spotted at a small cafe, sitting alone, his face partially hidden by sunglasses and a hat. A recluse in rural Ireland who'd purchased a small farm and never socialized with the neighbors. A wealthy benefactor in Switzerland who donated anonymously to children's charities and never showed his face at public events. Were these sightings real, or were they the products of wishful thinking and conspiracy theories? LaToya didn't know, but she couldn't ignore them. Michael had spent his entire life performing, wearing masks both literal and figurative. If anyone could disappear and create a new identity, it was him. The DNA results finally came back, and they confirmed everyone's worst fears. The body in Michael Jackson's tomb belonged to a man named Robert Chen, a homeless individual who died of a drug overdose in Los Angeles 3 days after Michael's death. His body had never been claimed by family, had been sitting in the county morgue when someone had seen an opportunity. Robert Chen was approximately the same age as Michael, similar in height and build. With enough cosmetic work and the right preparation, he could pass for the king of pop, at least the mourners viewing him from a distance during a memorial service. But Robert Chen's presence in Michael's tomb meant something more disturbing. It meant that Michael Jackson's actual body was somewhere else. Either he died and someone had hidden his real remains for reasons still unknown, or the unthinkable was true. Michael Jackson had faked his death and had been living in hiding for 12 years. Detective Rodriguez called a press conference, knowing that she couldn't contain this information any longer. The world had a right to know that for over a decade they'd been mourning at the wrong grave. She stood before the cameras, her face grave, and delivered the news that would dominate headlines for months. We can confirm that the remains in Michael Jackson's tomb at Forest Lawn Memorial Park do not belong to Michael Jackson. We are treating this as a criminal investigation and are pursuing multiple leads. We are asking anyone with information about Michael Jackson's activities in the days before his reported death to contact the lab immediately. The revelation sent shockwaves around the globe. News networks interrupted regular programming. Social media exploded with theories and speculation. Fans gathered at Forest Lawn, demanding answers. And somewhere, in a place still unknown, the truth about what really happened to Michael Jackson waited to be discovered. The investigation had expanded from a simple exhumation to a worldwide manhunt for either a body or a living legend. And the cameras had captured everything, creating a documentary that would force the world to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the death of the King of Pop. 3 months after the exhumation, Detective Rodriguez sat in a small cafe in Geneva, Switzerland, across from a woman who'd finally agreed to talk. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, and she'd been Michael Jackson's private physician during the final year of his life. She'd disappeared shortly after his death, and now Rodriguez understood why. They wanted him dead, Dr. Chen said quietly, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. Not in the literal sense. At first, they just wanted him gone, unable to perform, unable to interfere with their plans for his estate. But Michael figured it out. He knew that if he died, his music catalog would be worth billions. He knew they'd been waiting for it. Dr. Chen explained that Michael had approached her 9 months before his death with an impossible request. He wanted to disappear. Not die, but vanish completely, leaving behind a legacy that would be more valuable than anything he could create while alive. He'd watched Elvis Presley's estate grow exponentially after his death and understood the economics of dead celebrities. But more than that, he was exhausted. 50 years in the spotlight had destroyed him. He wanted to be free. The plan was elaborate, she continued. Michael had been collecting information on everyone around him, documenting the financial manipulation, the contract designed to trap him, the people who pretended to care but only saw dollar signs. He knew that if he just retired or walked away, they'd sue him into oblivion, drag him through courts for years, bleed him dry. But if he died, especially tragically, everything would end. The lawsuits would disappear. The pressure would stop, and his children would inherit an estate worth billions instead of the debt-ridden mess his life had become. Rodriguez listened, her recorder capturing every word. This was a confession that would change everything, but she needed details. How did you do it? How did you fake his death? Dr. Chen took a deep breath. Conrad Murray was the unwitting patsy. Michael hired him knowing the man was desperate for money and would do anything to keep his wealthy client happy. Michael asked for propofol, knowing Murray would eventually agree. But what Murray didn't know was that Michael had been building tolerance to the drug for months, taking small doses under my supervision, preparing his body to survive what should have been a lethal amount. The morning of June 25th had been carefully choreographed. Michael had taken propofol, but not the amount Murray believed he'd administered. Michael's body had gone into a state that mimicked death, extremely shallow breathing, no detectable pulse, cold extremities. He'd practiced it before, using meditation techniques he'd learned from Buddhist monks in yogic breathing methods that could slow his heart rate to nearly nothing. The 911 call was real panic from the staff who found him, Dr. Chen explained. Only 2 people knew the truth. Myself and Michael's head of security, a man he'd trusted for 20 years. We had to let everyone else believe he was dead because only real grief would sell the deception. The paramedics who arrived found what appeared to be a dead body. The emergency room doctors at UCLA pronounced him dead because all their instruments confirmed it. But I was there in the room, and I revived him once everyone had left. It took 8 minutes, the longest 8 minutes of my life. While the hospital was informing the family and the media was breaking the news that would shock the world, Dr. Chen had helped Michael escape through a service entrance. He'd been weak, barely able to walk, but alive. They'd taken him to a private clinic she'd established specifically for this purpose, where he'd recovered for 2 weeks under an assumed name. But what about the body? Rodriguez asked. The autopsy. Robert Chen was a tragic coincidence that became an opportunity, Dr. Chen said sadly. He died of a drug overdose the same day Michael disappeared. Same approximate age, race, and build. The man we paid to handle the switch was brilliant at his work. He'd done cosmetic reconstruction for the military, making unidentifiable remains presentable for families. He transformed Robert Chen's body into something that could pass for Michael at a funeral. The dental work was replicated using prosthetics. The surgical scars were recreated with precise incisions. The autopsy photos were altered digitally by someone with extensive experience in medical image manipulation. Everything was designed to withstand casual inspection, but not the kind of forensic analysis that Dr. Foster eventually performed. The question that burned in Rodriguez's mind was obvious. Where is he now? Where has Michael Jackson been for the past 12 years? Dr. Chen smiled for the first time. That, detective, is what Michael wanted me to tell you. He's ready to come home. He's watched his children grow from a distance, seen them thrive without the burden of his fame crushing them. He's seen his estate handled properly, his music reaching new generations. He's had 12 years of peace, of being just another face in the crowd. But the exhumation changed everything. He never intended for an innocent man's body to be disturbed. He never wanted his mother to suffer wondering if her son had been murdered. The guilt has been eating him alive. Dr. Chen reached into a bag and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a letter, handwritten in the distinctive style that Michael had used for decades. He's at a private residence in Auckland, New Zealand. He's been living there for the past 5 years under the name Michael Rowe. He wants to meet with you, with his mother, with his children. He wants to explain everything himself and face whatever consequences come from what he's done. Rodriguez held the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting matched samples she'd studied from Michael's personal journals. The paper had his fingerprints on it, prints that would match the ones on file from his multiple background checks over the years. This was real. Michael Jackson was alive. The flight to New Zealand took 14 hours, and Rodriguez spent every minute planning how to handle what would be the most significant case of her career. She brought a small team, 2 federal agents, a forensic specialist to verify identity, and a video crew to document everything. LaToya and Catherine Jackson were on the same flight, sitting 3 rows ahead, both women silent and pale with anticipation and fear. When they landed in Auckland, a private car took them to a coastal property 30 miles north of the city. The house was modest by celebrity standards, a 2-story contemporary design with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Security was minimal, just a low fence and some basic cameras. This was the home of someone trying to disappear, not someone flaunting wealth. Dr. Chen met them at the door. He's nervous, she said simply. 12 years is a long time to be dead. He's not sure how to be alive again. They found him in a sunlit room filled with keyboards and recording equipment. Michael Jackson sat at a piano, his back to them, playing a melody that sounded both familiar and completely new. He'd aged, his hair now streaked with gray, his face lined with wrinkles that fame had never allowed him to earn naturally. He wore simple clothes, jeans and a white T-shirt, no gloves, no sequins, no costume. Just a man at a piano. When he turned around, Catherine Jackson gasped. Her son, older, different, but unmistakably her son. The eyes were the same, that piercing gaze that could convey more emotion than most people could express with 1,000 words. LaToya started crying immediately, crossing the room in 3 steps and pulling him into an embrace that he returned with equal desperation. Mom, Michael said, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Catherine touched his face, her fingers tracing the lines around his eyes as if to confirm he was real. Why? She asked. Why did you put us through this? Why did you let us mourn when you were alive? Michael's explanation took hours. He talked about the prison that fame had become, how every moment of his life had been documented, analyzed, and criticized. He spoke about the constant lawsuits, the false accusations, the people who pretended to be friends but were really parasites feeding off his talent. He described the final straw, discovering that his own business managers had been embezzling millions from his accounts, setting up deals that would keep him in debt even as his music earned billions. "I realized that I was worth more dead than alive," he said quietly. "Not to you, not to my real family, but to the industry. They were waiting for me to die so they could control my legacy without me interfering. The This Is It concerts were supposed to be my comeback, but I knew they'd kill me. Not intentionally, but the schedule they planned, the pressure, the demands on a 50-year-old body that had already been through so much. I'd have been dead within a year. So I decided to die on my own terms instead." He explained how he'd spent the last 12 years. The first 3 years in Bahrain, guests of the royal family who'd protected him from the world. Then Ireland, where he'd lived on a small farm under an assumed name, learning to cook his own meals and live without staff for the first time since he was 5 years old. Finally, New Zealand, where he'd bought this house and spent his days composing music that no one would ever hear, painting pictures that would never be displayed, and finding peace in anonymity. "I watched my children through private investigators," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I saw Paris grow into this incredible young woman, so Prince become a man, so Blanket find his own path. I wanted to contact them so many times, but I knew that if I revealed myself, everything would unravel. The lawsuits would start again. The media would destroy them. So I stayed away, telling myself it was for their own good." Detective Rodriguez had remained quiet throughout the confession, but now she had to speak. "Mr. Jackson, you understand that what you've done is illegal on multiple levels. Fraud, falsifying death records, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. There will be consequences." "I know," Michael said simply. "I'm ready to face them. I'm tired of hiding. The exhumation showed me that my plan had collateral damage I never intended. That man, Robert Chen, he had a life too, probably a hard one. His body deserved to rest in peace, not be used as a prop in my escape. And my mother, my family, my fans, they deserve the truth. I was selfish and cowardly, and I need to make it right." The verification process took 3 days. DNA tests confirmed his identity beyond any doubt. Fingerprints matched. Voice analysis matched. Dental records matched. Michael Jackson, who the world had mourned for 12 years, was definitively alive. The question now was what to do about it. The legal team that assembled to handle the situation was unprecedented. Experts in criminal law, estate law, international law, and even constitutional law debated the implications. Could you prosecute someone for faking their own death when no one had directly been defrauded? Michael's estate had grown enormously, but all profits had gone to his children and designated charities exactly as his will had specified. No one had been financially harmed by the deception. The media storm that erupted when the news broke was unlike anything the world had seen since. Well, since Michael Jackson's death 12 years earlier. News networks ran 24-hour coverage. Social media crashed multiple times as billions of people tried to process the impossible. Michael Jackson was alive. The biggest conspiracy theory in music history had turned out to be true. Fan reaction was divided. Some were overjoyed, celebrating in the streets, crying tears of happiness that their idol had returned. Others felt betrayed, angry that they'd been manipulated into mourning someone who'd been alive all along. Vigils that had been held annually at Forest Lawn turned into protests. The single white glove that fans had left at his crypt for years felt like a cool joke. Michael's children faced the most difficult situation. Paris, Prince, and Blanket had spent their formative years believing their father was dead, had grieved and healed and built lives around that loss. Now they had to reckon with the fact that he'd been alive the entire time, watching from a distance but choosing not to be part of their lives. The reunions were private, handled away from cameras, and by all accounts, intensely emotional and complicated. The legal resolution came 6 months later. Michael Jackson pled guilty to multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The judge, taking into account the unique circumstances and the lack of direct financial victims, sentenced him to 5 years probation, 5,000 hours of community service, and restitution payments to various parties who'd been affected by the deception. Most significantly, he was required to donate $10 million to charities supporting homeless individuals in honor of Robert Chen, the man whose body had been used in the elaborate scheme. The public appearances that followed were surreal. Michael Jackson, at 66 years old, faced a world that had thought him dead. He gave a series of interviews, each one revealing more about his decision and his years in hiding. He spoke about the freedom he'd found in anonymity, how he'd been able to walk through grocery stores and parks without causing riots. He talked about watching sunsets without photographers documenting his every expression. He described the simple joy of ordering coffee without someone screaming or fainting. But he also spoke about the loneliness. The isolation of knowing you can never really connect with anyone because your entire life is based on a lie. The guilt that ate at him every time he saw his mother's grief on television. The desperate longing to hold his children that he'd suppressed for over a decade. The nights when he'd almost called the whole thing off, almost revealed himself, almost chosen truth over freedom. 1 year after the exhumation, Michael Jackson gave his first and only public performance since returning from the dead. It was at a small theater in Los Angeles, capacity 500 people, tickets given away through a lottery system to ensure that ordinary fans, not just the wealthy, could attend. No media was allowed inside, but everyone who attended could bring their phones. He walked onto the stage to thunderous applause that lasted 10 full minutes. He was older now, moved differently, his voice not quite the same instrument it had been in his prime. But when he started to sing Man in the Mirror, something magical happened. The audience didn't see a 66-year-old man who'd faked his death and run away. They saw the person they'd always loved, the one who'd given them joy through his music, who'd made them believe they could change the world. By the time he reached the final chorus, everyone in the theater was crying, including Michael himself. He'd spent 12 years running from his identity, but standing on that stage, he finally understood something profound. Michael Jackson, the persona, had been a prison, but Michael Jackson, the man, had always been free. He'd just been too afraid to claim that freedom while alive in the world's eyes. The documentary that Sandra Lopez assembled from all the footage became the most-watched program in television history. From the moment they'd opened the tomb to the final performance, every second had been captured. The cameras had caught everything: the shock, the investigation, the revelation, and ultimately, the strange redemption of a man who tried to escape himself and discovered that you can't run from who you are. Michael's final statement to the public came in the form of a new song, released exactly 1 year after his resurrection. It was called The Man Behind the Mask, and it told his story with brutal honesty. The music video featured footage from his years in hiding, interspersed with clips from his famous performances. The juxtaposition was striking. The glittering superstar versus the gray-haired man feeding ducks in a park. Both were real. Both were him. The song ended with a simple message displayed on screen. To everyone who mourned me, I'm sorry. To everyone who loved me, thank you. To everyone who judged me, I understand. I was never meant to be normal, but I spent 12 years trying. Now I know that being extraordinary isn't a curse, it's a gift. And I wasted that gift by hiding it. I won't make that mistake again. Michael Jackson lived for 8 more years after his return, using his second chance to reconnect with his children, create new music, and advocate for causes he believed in. He never performed another large-scale concert, but he did appear at charity events in small venues, always insisting that ticket be affordable and accessible to regular people. He wrote an autobiography that became the best-selling book of the decade, detailing everything from his childhood to his years in hiding to his journey back to life. When he finally did pass away in 2033, at age 74, from natural causes, the world mourned genuinely this time. There was no mystery, no conspiracy theories, no questions about what had really happened. He died in his home in New Zealand, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, at peace with the life he'd lived and the choices he'd made. His funeral was small and private, but millions around the world held their own memorials. This time, when they sealed his tomb at Forest Lawn, everyone knew it was really him inside. And this time, the white glove placed on top of the casket was put there by his daughter Paris, a symbol not of mystery, but of love and legacy and the complicated truth about one of the most extraordinary lives ever lived. The cameras had caught everything, and in doing so, had documented not just a deception, but a story about fame, freedom, and the price we pay for both.